To be counted among the richest 1% of people in Australia, you apparently need a net worth of $6,900,000. If you're 60 years old, looking at your super balance, and quietly wondering whether you've fallen behind that number, I want you to hear this first. That $6,900,000 is not a survival number. It's a status number, built by a wealth report, not by your actual life. Here's the part those reports never mention. Plenty of Australians sitting in the so-called top 10% of earners, individual income above $133,000, still feel like they're one bad month away from trouble. They're carrying a mortgage sized for a $2 million house, running 2 cars, and covering school fees that eat the whole pay rise before it lands in the account. The income is real. The room to breathe isn't. I've watched this happen to people who did everything right on paper. They chased a number that was never designed for them. A number built for someone with no mortgage left to pay and a much bigger pay packet than most of us will ever see. You are not behind just because your balance doesn't have 8 figures in it. You might already be closer to actual freedom than someone earning 10 times what you do. So here's where we're going. I'll walk you through the real 2026 wealth ladder for Australia, top 10, top 5, and top 1%, so you know exactly where you sit. Then I'm going to show you a different number entirely, one that lets you draw $70,000 a year, tax-free, in retirement, using only a small slice of that $6,900,000 headline figure. That's the number that actually matters, and most people never get shown how it's worked out. Let's start with where you actually sit on the income ladder in Australia this year. To be in the top 10% of individual earners, you need a taxable income around $133,000. Move up to the top 5%, and that number sits closer to $189,000. Get into the top 1%, and you're looking at an individual income around $375,000. Those are real figures from the tax office's own statistics, adjusted for how wages have grown since the last full data set was published. Now watch what happens to that top figure once the tax system takes its share. Someone earning $375,000 sits inside the top tax bracket, paying 45 cents in every dollar above $190,000, plus the Medicare levy on top of that. Run the full calculation, and that $375,000 income shrinks to a little over $230,000 in the hand. It's worth sitting with that for a second. A person earning 3 times the median wage still hands almost half of every extra dollar straight back to the tax system once they cross that threshold. That's not a complaint about tax. It funds the very age pension and health system we'll get to later. It's simply the reality of what a high headline income actually turns into once it reaches your account. And if that same person is carrying a $2 million mortgage in Sydney at 6%, the interest alone costs them $120,000 a year before they've paid for a single meal, bill, or school fee. This is the trap hiding inside a high income. It doesn't sit there waiting to be spent. It gets swallowed by the lifestyle that came with earning it: the commute, the wardrobe, the postcode, the school enrollment. 2 people earning a combined $240,000 comfortably, a top 10% household, often end up with less real surplus at the end of the month than a retired couple with a paid-off home drawing $80,000 a year, tax-free, from their super. That's not a coincidence. It's what happens when income and expenses climb together year after year until the gap between them barely moves. The Australian Bureau of Statistics has tracked this pattern for years. Income at the top keeps rising. Genuine surplus, the money actually left over to save or invest, grows far more slowly. But income is only half the picture. It's the flow, not the pool. What matters just as much is what you've actually built, your net worth, sitting underneath everything else. And here's where it gets interesting, Because if you own a home in Sydney or Melbourne, you might already be sitting on paper wealth that would surprise you, while still feeling like you can't afford a new fridge if it breaks down tomorrow. Meet Gary and Sue. They're 62, living in Glen Waikively, and on paper, they look like they've made it. Their home is worth $2,500,000. They've got $400,000 sitting in super. Add it up, and their net worth comes to $2,900,000 comfortably, inside the wealthiest fifth of households in the country. And yet Gary and Sue feel poor. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but in the quiet way that shows up when the rates notice or the electricity bill lands in the mailbox. Here's why. Of that $2,900,000, about $2,500,000 is what I'd call static wealth. It doesn't produce a cent of income. It just sits there. And it actually costs them close to $15,000 a year in council rates, insurance, and maintenance, just to keep existing. I used to think net worth was the only scoreboard that mattered. I was wrong. I've sat with couples who have $3 million tied up in property and still feel a flicker of dread every time the electricity bill arrives, because none of that $3 million pays a single power bill on its own. This isn't a story about Gary and Sue doing anything wrong. Property was the retirement plan handed to their whole generation. Buy the biggest home you can manage, pay it off, and let the market do the rest. Nobody sat them down and explained that every dollar poured into an ever bigger home is a dollar that stops being available for anything else, unless you eventually sell it or borrow against it. That's the invisible cost hiding behind a proud-looking address. Gary and Sue don't need to chase the $6,900,000 top 1% mark to feel secure. What they actually need is to convert some of that static wealth into spendable wealth, the kind that shows up in the bank account every fortnight, not the kind that shows up on a property valuation once a year. Think about your own numbers for a second. If most of what you're worth is tied up in bricks and mortar, ask yourself how much of that could actually reach your bank account without selling the roof over your head. For a lot of homeowners nearing retirement, the honest answer is not much at all, and that's exactly the gap this video is going to help you close. So the real question isn't how much you're worth on a spreadsheet. It's how much of what you own can actually pay your bills. Once you start measuring wealth that way, the number you need to feel like the top 10% turns out to be a lot smaller than $6,900,000. How much smaller? That's next. So what is the real number? Not the one from a global wealth report, the one that actually decides whether you can retire well in Australia in 2026. Start with the age pension. If you're a homeowner couple, the full combined age pension currently comes to around $47,070 a year. That's not a fallback for people who didn't save enough. It's the floor everyone in this system is built on top of, and it rises with inflation. Now look at what ASFA calls a comfortable retirement for a couple, currently around $77,375 a year. Subtract the pension from that target, and the actual gap you need to fund yourself comes to about $30,305 a year, not $77,375, not $6,900,000, just $30,305. Here's the calculation that matters. To generate $30,305 a year using a safe drawdown rate of 5%, you need $606,100 sitting in super. A 5% drawdown isn't a guess pulled out of thin air. It's roughly the rate that lets a balanced super portfolio keep paying an income without running dry too early, especially with the age pension doing part of the work alongside it. ASFA itself puts the comfortable lump sum for a couple at around $690,000, which happens to land at almost exactly 10% of that $6,900,000 top 1% figure everyone's been measuring themselves against. 10%. That's the entire gap between the number that funds your actual life and the number that just impresses a stranger at a dinner party. There's one more piece worth checking while we're here: your assessable assets. As a homeowner couple, you can hold up to $499,000 in assessable assets, not counting your home, and still receive the full age pension. Your family home doesn't count against you in that test at all. That single rule is why the home you've already paid off is doing more work for your retirement than most people realize, even though it never hands you cash directly. It's also worth remembering these thresholds move. The age pension itself is indexed twice a year, and the super contribution caps step up again from the 1st of July, giving you a little more room to top up concessional and non-concessional contributions if you're still working and want to close the gap faster. None of that requires a dramatic change in lifestyle. It just requires knowing which lever is actually available to you at 55, 60, or 65, instead of assuming the only lever left is working longer. If you've spent years feeling like you need one more promotion, one more decade of work before you're allowed to feel secure, sit with that $606,100 figure for a moment. It's smaller than most Sydney or Melbourne mortgages, and it might already be closer to your actual super balance than you think. None of this means the work is done the moment you reach $606,100 or $690,000. What happens if the market drops the same year you retire? That's the moment that actually separates the people who stay wealthy from the people who only ever looked wealthy. Let's stress test it. Picture a 20% drop in the ASX 200 landing in the same year you turn 67. It's happened before, and it will happen again. The only real question is whether you're positioned for it when it does. Here's the unprepared version. Gary and Sue kept their entire $400,000 in super sitting in a high growth option, the kind that performs brilliantly when markets are calm. The market drops 20% right as they retire. Their balance falls to $320,000, and panic does the rest. They sell near the bottom, lock in the loss, and spend the next 5 years trying to recover from a decision made in a single bad week. Now here's the prepared version, using what I'll call the 3-bucket approach. Before retiring, you set aside roughly 2 years of spending, say $140,000 in cash and term deposits. When the market drops 20%, you're not selling a single share to cover your bills. You're living off the buckets while the market sorts itself out. We've seen this play out before. After the 2008 financial crisis, it took the ASX 200 close to a decade to claw back to its old peak on price alone, even though dividends kept arriving the whole time for anyone who didn't sell. That's the part people forget when they're staring at a falling balance on a screen. The income didn't stop, only the headline number did. This is exactly why chasing the $6,900,000 top 1% figure misses the point so badly. It's a snapshot, frozen at a single moment, vulnerable to a single bad year. The age pension floor underneath your retirement isn't. It rises with inflation, regardless of what the ASX 200 does that quarter. Build your plan around the floor that can't fall, and the market's bad years stop being emergencies. They just become weather you wait out. And here's the part worth remembering before we move on. The people who stayed wealthy through 2008 weren't the ones with the biggest balance going in. They were the ones who never had to sell at the bottom, because they'd already set the cash aside to ride it out. Here's something worth naming honestly. None of this comparison anxiety is really about money. It's about what psychologists call relative deprivation, the feeling that comes not from your actual bank balance, but from the neighbor's new driveway or a workmate's photos from an overseas trip. It's completely normal to feel a small twinge of dread every time a headline announces what it takes to be in the top 1% this year. Our brains weren't built for a world with wealth reports and rankings. They were built for a small tribe, constantly checking status against the people standing right next to us. None of this makes you weak or irrational. It makes you human, wired by millions of years of evolution long before wealth reports and social media ever existed. Naming the mechanism is often enough to loosen its grip, because once you can see relative deprivation for what it is, it stops running the show quietly in the background. I remember a client who finally reached $2 million in super. On paper, that put him solidly in the top 5% of retirees his age. He was still buying the home brand milk out of habit, still flinching at restaurant prices, because somewhere along the way his mindset had locked into scarcity and never got the memo that the number had changed. That's the real shift worth making, moving from status wealth, how much you have compared to everyone else, to utility wealth, what that money can actually let you do. Status wealth is a ladder with no top rung, because there's always someone one step higher. Utility wealth asks a completely different question. Can you cover the electricity bill without checking the balance first? Can you take the grandkids somewhere without doing mental math in the car park? That's a question your own number can actually answer. There's one more piece to this, and it has nothing to do with earning another dollar. It involves rules the government has already written down, rules most people never bother reading properly. So let's bring this back to something simple. Being rich in Australia was never really about hitting $6,900,000. It's about owning a roof outright and holding a spendable super balance somewhere around $606,100 to $690,000, funding the gap the age pension doesn't cover. If you've spent years feeling like you're behind everyone else, despite doing the responsible thing every single year, that feeling was never really evidence. It was comparison, dressed up as fact. You're very likely wealthier, in the way that actually matters, than the headlines have been letting you believe. If that lands for you, and you're after a comfortable retirement rather than a number that impresses strangers, stay around. This channel is built entirely around the math that hands you your weekends back, not the math that keeps you working 2 more years to chase a bigger headline. Start simply. Check your own combined super balance against the $606,100 figure we worked through earlier and see how close the gap actually is once the age pension is doing its share of the lifting. Then look at what's still static in your own life, the equity sitting in your home or an investment property you've been meaning to deal with, and ask whether it's working as hard for you as it could be. Tell me where you're at. If you're aiming for a genuinely comfortable retirement over a status number, drop the word freedom in the comments below. I read everyone, and it helps me know what to cover next.